New polling shows President Trump is getting mixed reviews for his handling of the economy. The new figures from the Associated Press and NORC show nearly two-thirds of Americans describe the economy as being in good shape. That's an increase from the beginning of this year. But the survey reveals 51% of those polled disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy, compared to 47% of those who approve, and only 17% of those asked say they received a tax cut last year, despite government and private sector figures showing a clear majority of taxpayers owed less after the president's tax overhaul passed in 2017. The results also show most Americans do not believe they are personally benefiting from President Trump's trade policies. Joining us now, economics writer at the Associated Press, Josh Boak. Josh, good morning. Good to see you. So how do you square the numbers, the first two in that poll, that Americans feel the economy is doing well, but not as many give President Trump credit for that?
Sure. One of the big things that we see when we dig into the numbers at this poll is that, yes, there's political polarization, and President Trump might say the economy is strong, but when Americans look at what's happening in their own lives, they don't necessarily see it. They don't believe they got a tax cut, and they don't believe that the tariffs will help them or their families. So that contrast we can see where they say the overall economy is strong, but the fundamental change proposed by the president, they haven't seen in their bank accounts, they haven't seen in their mortgage payments, and they haven't seen in their daily lives.
That's interesting, Steve. So it's a perception. Maybe they're hearing the president say it. Maybe they see the low unemployment and other figures. They say the economy is doing well broadly. They believe that, but it's not helping me personally.
I think that's right. I think that about a quarter of people think that they're not as well off as they were before all of Trump. I think a quarter think they're better off, and half think it's about the same. So 3/4 don't think they're better off. But that said, the overall perception is positive. There was another poll that came out either yesterday or the day before by the economist YouGov that gave Trump a 47% approval rate on the handling of the economy, the only issue on which he was over 50% on his handling of an issue. I don't really think the economy is, you know, as of literally today, enters its longest peacetime recovery in history, also its slowest peacetime recovery in history, but its longest, and unemployment is 3.6%. I really don't think there's any view other than the fact that the economy is a tailwind for the president at this point in time. That could change, but I think right now it helps him in his reelection.
And of course, no, he's running on that. He's running on the economy. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The numbers show that President Obama started all this, and the current president is continuing that, but this will be the case the president makes to voters.
Yeah, I mean, he'd be better off if he was running on the economy and not merely the myriad grievances that animate him from day to day. Josh, one of the more fascinating things about this poll is the marked decrease in the number of Republicans who say that Trump's tariffs will help the economy. You're at 50% of Republicans agreeing with the president. That's a lot, but it's a 20% decrease from August. Suggests that Republicans, even the political imperative of supporting the president when he's making dubious assertions, isn't cutting water anymore.
That's right. And I think we have to start digging beneath the national averages when we look at what's actually happening in terms of how people perceive the economy. Support among Republicans has weakened. So 8 out of 10 Republicans approve of how Trump is handling the economy, but only 7 out of 10 approve of his taxes and tariffs. And then when you drill down on the tariffs in particular, what they're saying is our support has weakened, we don't see it helping us, and we don't see it helping our communities. And not surprisingly, that hurts the president's hand as he goes around the country saying that tariffs are paying for themselves. When I interviewed voters for this story, what they said is, I know he's saying this, but I don't believe him. And these are even his own supporters saying that. And I think what this poll really hints at is that people know the national numbers, but they also know their own lives, and they know what the president is saying, and trust matters.
Josh, I wonder, too, how much do you think these assessments folks have of the economy and Trump's role in it are just sort of, their assessment of the situation is dwarfed by their broader assessment of Trump, what he represents in our politics, what he represents in our culture. I'm just thinking back to, you know, Bill Clinton when he was president and the economic numbers, when folks thought the economy was in great shape, his approval rating on the economy was 20 points higher than Trump's. His approval rating overall was 20 or 30 points higher. That old line about how it's the economy stupid, does that apply anymore?
So the economy now is very different than what it was under Bill Clinton. We've got more younger people, we've got way more older people, we've got more college graduates, we've had an extended period of wage stagnation that we're recovering from. If you look at housing data, home prices in 75% of U.S. metro areas have increased faster than incomes, which means you have price pressures that the middle class are now dealing with that they didn't deal with in the past. And you do have polarization. The long and short end of it is, for an economy this strong, we have not seen numbers this low in the past 6 presidencies. So the president is weak on the economy relative to other presidents, given the current dynamics.
We'll see how much he rides this issue heading into the re-election campaign. Economics writer at the Associated Press, Josh Boak. Josh, thanks for being with us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.